kind of less of a, not really like thinking about visual design systems in terms of like UI and stuff, but more about a modular visual system for when you start thinking about brands and product design, thinking about how you kind of represent some kind of thing out in the real world. So, you know, when we're actually creating products here at the CoLab, I typically have sort of like a systematic set of deliverables or things that I think about when I'm trying to design like a brand for a prototype that we're making, and then also a bunch of assets for later on, so that thing can actually stand up and have a life of its own when it gets passed on to other people who are designers and or other people on the core team here at IDEO who have to then take that brand assets and all that stuff that I've made and start applying it to other things without me having to like hand walk them through it or like make it for them. So just to jump off, I think like we'll start with making a color palette and then move on to a bunch of other things. Like I think like you always should start with color. And I think for a lot of people are scared of color because they don't know like what's good or what's bad or like. And I think it's hard to it's easy to be very nebulous when it comes to like justifying why you made a color choice. But I think like you know, just color can be rooted in you know, thinking about the history of a brand or making analogies to other things in a space or creating feelings. I think like thinking about how color psychology can start to kind of affect us in the way that we perceive something. Like, you know, I might, and I think for something that has happened now in a recent shift has been everything's been moving to like, you know, more saturated colors because we're as a society going towards more things on screens. I think like in the past, you know, we were focusing on like all print colors and you know, specifying Pantones for brands and stuff like that. And now we have brands that live almost exclusively in a digital space. So we have a little bit more freedom to actually get, you know, we can like literally just say like, these are my RGB colors and I don't have any fucking print colors. Or even so, just taking those colors in Photoshop and like actually like, you know, finding the closest CMYK equivalents or, you know, then matching afterwards. But starting with that super saturated RGB color that, you know, we might not have been able to use in the past. But when I make a color palette, I usually keep these three things in mind. Is just to always have grounds and neutrals. So like, you know, in these palettes, you'll always want to have a super foundational dark color, and also a very high, like high lightness bright color, such as like white or maybe it's a gray. It could even be just an accent color. I really feel like if you're limiting yourself to never use white in a brand, it's kind of like pretty limiting. You're just going to end up probably just showering people in a very bright color just because you're going to want to have some sort of high contrast reversal. So I think like either having a white or something that's close to white, it might not have to be super pure white, but it could be close. Just thinking about that. So also be informed about where these colors will be represented. Like I said, you know, if I am making a brand for something that will exclusively only be ever seen in a browser or on a screen, I have kind of like free reign over how, you know, how that color is going to be represented, rather than if something is going to get printed off somewhere, or like you know, somebody's going to have to make a bunch of assets that where printers could fuck up colors, or you know, I might need to specify some kind of thing for a printer. Like knowing that ahead of time and making your color palette modular, or you know, designing for that later on in the game is important. And then also like, don't be afraid to be super loud. Like I think like a lot of people now are, you know, kind of like going towards this like really crazy like brutalist structure of like, you know, we're gonna use like fucking RGB blue for our brand color and just like shower you in like this painful, you know, bright, ridiculously like, you know, I don't know, 000 FFF kind of thing going on. But I think like you can do that, and like I don't make like I don't usually tell people like, you know, that's against the rules kind of thing. I think you should go more towards what has been kind of like historically safe in the past, and then break that when necessary. So I think you know, if you are going to be loud, you have to have the attitude or have that be like a thing that is fitting for that brand. And we'll talk about how that works later. This is sort of just like a jumping off point just classically in color theory when you're thinking about how you're going to structure a color palette. You might start by just thinking about one color that, you know, it's in the region of where you want to be, and then define a color palette based on our actual color system in the color wheel. So with normal color, like all of these, I've arranged primary and secondary colors in a ring, and so this is like a normal color wheel, as has been kind of like described for many years. And so I mean, obviously, like if I'm choosing red, I could go with a complementary color scheme where I'm using colors that are directly across from each other. They're complements from each other on the color wheel. And so, you know, here at the bottom, I've created a complementary color scheme. And really, that's actually kind of where our roots of primary colors from thinking about, you know, when you go to grade school, it's like red, yellow, blue kind of thing, has come from, because it's a complementary color scheme. And you know, you can go even further and say, well, I think, you know, I can use split complementary color in a case where I might want to use something that is a complement in addition to the two closest secondary colors close to that complement. So this is more saying like I might need more variety in what I'm doing, and I mean it kind of gets into the realm of more of how RGB kind of started, but it's not a true reversal of the triad. Like if you think about RGB versus CMYK, have you ever seen the you know, like the additive and subtractive color Venn diagram? They're actual like reversals of each other, whereas here split complementary gets close, but it's not within that gamut. So to do that, you would actually need triadic color, which here you can see that we have CMY, and then if I drew a triangle in the opposite direction, it would be RGB or violet. It's just more intense. So that's how you actually get your inverse of additive and subtractive color. So, and actually now that I'm looking at this, I realize that I left out some triangles. Because you can totally just make a triangle in any of these formats here and create a triadic color scheme. So yeah, so these are just some actual like color traditions that we can start with. And also analogous color. So analogous colors are all on the same side. So like they're the two closest colors technically would be the two closest colors to your base color on either side would be the two analogous colors that are associated with that color. You can also achieve analogous color by using tints or shades of the same color, the same base color. And here a tint is actually something that has added white to it by 10%. So that would be a tint up from that base color, and then a shade would be 10% with black added. So you're only adding black. You're not actually adding any color to alter the hue of that color. You're just making it lighter or darker. So just talking about like logos and word marks for a minute. So what is a word mark? I feel like when people think about logos, they just think about like little icons or like kind of just, you know, like some sort of icon set that somebody drew up in like 5 minutes and like that's it, and it's good, it's iconic. But really, I think like a lot of brands have, you know, tons and tons of different kind of like lock-up iterations with how their brand is represented. So for instance, like a word mark here is actually just thinking about when you have text, and oftentimes like nowadays people just like type out the name of their brand in a font and then that's it. You know, like I think like originally these word marks were meant to actually be like a handcrafted, like actually hand-drawn piece of design. And so I kind of get sad when I think about like somebody just typing up something in a font and then, yeah, and that's it. That's my logo. I think like for instance, like the FedEx logo here actually, I don't know, I think everybody knows this, but there's a hidden arrow inside the actual like E and X negative space, like moving forward and thinking about how they get things from point A to point B. You know, and something like Kleenex has survived with a a super kind of like hand lettered font for years, and I think like there's a lot of roundness in these shapes. When I think of Kleenex, I think of something soft. So obviously a bunch of organic forms work well for that brand. And Citibank is all about creating an umbrella for your financial future. And that was actually designed by Paula Scher. It's really cool. We'll talk about her later. But so you can kind of see how these Wordmarks are, maybe they started with typefaces, maybe they started as fonts, but the designers who made them created some sort of meaning around the actual brand's intentions to create something that is more than actually just letters. So I think how you start to think about creating some sort of visual metaphor for your brands is kind of really up to you. It depends on the actual nature of what you're trying to accomplish. For Citibank, maybe focusing on like this financial umbrella, or like rainbow in a dark cloud kind of thing is what they were trying to accomplish. For you, it could be totally different. So thinking about how you start to think about like iconography in your brands is something to be really taken not so lightly. I'm inspired a lot by super old design. I really think we should have stopped designing a long time ago. This is some work by Ivan Shemaev, who actually did the T logo. I found out like only 2 weeks ago. This is kind of interesting. But there are tons and tons of old design, and I think like these are some of them are Wordmarks, but some of them are actually just logos, which and I think like at the get-go, the thing that you notice about all of these is that they're black and white. Like they work in black and white, but they also work in color. So designing brands that live in black and white is really a must, just because you're gonna have some application of this somewhere where you're only gonna have one color to work with, and if your two-color logo doesn't transfer well to having only one color being applied, then there might be a problem. Some ways you can start to get around that would be like thinking about maybe if my logo has to live with like a semicircle and only a semicircle between two, like a split colors. You can actually start to create tints of a color where you actually just make it like 50% opaque. So maybe the top is full color and then the bottom half is 50% white, for example, to get around that a little bit. That's just a technique that's been employed. And Saul Bass, super great. A lot of different kind of like, and I think in 2D design you start to think about these kind of like Gestalt principles, which we'll talk about in a second, but like here we have a lot of movement from places and a lot of like similarity and proximity being used to create a sense of depth and the illusion of highlight or low light, which is kind of interesting how simulated texture is used. Paula Scher is actually a really amazing designer. You should check it out. She's at Pentagram right now, but she made like the CNN logo and C logo, super awesome. And obviously Paul Rand. Paul Rand actually also did the IDEO logo originally, thinking about like people in the past. Those logos actually, oftentimes when you have like a limited amount of space or shapes, like in these logos, you actually employ a bunch of different techniques to try to create visual interest or meaning. So a lot of the times people will rely on these kind of these Gestalt principles of perception to talk about how you can start to create visual metaphor or visual interest in a logo design. And obviously these are very simple things. Really, so the law of similarity is just that when you have similarly shaped things, they can start to create units that end up creating a larger structure. And because they're similar, our brain associates them with creating an overall shape. And just as common on the right there, we have dissimilarity, where you have anomaly in a series of shapes. And that could be with color, that could be with like spacing, it could be with anything. Afterwards, you have continuity. So even though I'm creating movement through this A, I know that like my eye is actually drawn to that star just because I've created this kind of like stark contrast between where like the actual top visual mass of the A is and the bottom parts of the actual legs that make it up. I don't really think about the legs, I just think about how I've created an implied line in this continuity of a shape. And then we can talk about closure, which is, really this swan actually has like a sort of like, sort of almost like a fruit shape hidden inside of it. And so the edges there don't actually meet, but I can actually make the rest of that in my head. I don't actually need those two shapes to meet. So playing around with how close you can get to abstracting something to create the illusion of having two images in a shape, but not having those things touch or having them not be complete can help you abstract visual metaphors. Proximity is creating shape through a bunch of smaller units that are just kind of like close enough to each other to create line. So here, like I can create the illusion of like a Y or a three-pronged like pipe instead with these little dots, and also figuring ground. So I think like the top right example could also be an example of figuring ground as well as closure. Whereas like figure is here there's a hidden arrow moving forward in the center of a star that has two angled shapes to create a star. So you can actually try to hide things within things using negative space or positive space. Common fate actually is talking about how you can create movement or separation through objects that are similar in structure but different in color or different in contrast somehow. So like these two, to the top half and the bottom half of this create an abstract E, but really I can create visual interest by distinguishing those two halves that are also symmetrical by using a different color on the top half maybe. Very obviously simple metaphors, but just an explainer. Common region refers to having a set of shapes or masses that are in the same region, and then creating a separation or an informational separation between those two things using color or visual mass. So like here at the bottom half, this little staircase object, I've encapsulated a bunch of shapes and then separated them from the other top half, which could actually create some other metaphor. So things to remember when designing a logo: always make sure that your logo works in black and white. Limiting your color use helps you keep printing costs down, and really, if you're talking about the digital world, like colors are free here. And also, a logo should be just as recognizable at small sizes as it should be at large sizes. I'm sorry, I can't speak right now. So thinking about that, you can also have different versions of maybe your logo type or word mark. So that you can actually be more modular in your systems. So when I was thinking about example for the, we have a perspectives event, which is a member event for our member companies here at CoLab. I was actually creating a very wide word mark, and then I created a bunch of different elements of a visual language such that I could represent our logo and our actual identity for the event at different sizes. So for example, this like little P language is actually, the real actual logo type is a bunch of extruded rectangles that are kind of like set forward in 3D space, so that when you, this medium format thing is just the actual model itself turned in different directions. So it's like moving and being seen from different perspectives. So thinking about how that could be used to create a visual language is an element that also could make my footprint smaller on a page. But I think if I only have like an app icon or a 2x2 aspect ratio or 1x1 aspect ratio space, I can just use the P that I've created in a different style to represent the same thing in less space. So keeping that in mind as you're creating these kind of assets for your brand can help you be more flexible when you're talking about how you actually represent yourself in different places. So just some examples of like some different kind of like setups for how you could start thinking about like creating brands. Like, I mean, here we have like some of Amy Hood's work, and you see that like the actual kind of full logo type is this big Nash Parker with a like like a tagline underneath, and then they have a smaller, a kind of like shorter version of the tagline and a stacked version of the logo to have it fit in like a square aspect ratio. But they also have a monogram and a little tiny fave icon for that uses reuses this star element. And they also even have badges, which I'm kind of have a large proclivity towards using. I think like creating these kinds of elements can also sub in as like elements for like swag or like other applications for later on when you're talking about physical assets or artifacts for a brand. And having those things defined ahead of time can help you create a much more kind of versatile system. And so a lot of Steve Wolf's work, you should check him out, it's super good. And these, so to the right is an example of how you would start thinking about a modular brand system when you're thinking about something that has like different flavors or different types. So like on the right we have a bunch of different flavors of an item, but the difference is obviously these kind of like this this icon family, but also color has been used to like create different forms of this same layout. And so we can actually start to think about the things that they have in common, but also the fact that they all share the same visual mass, but they're just only differing in the color and the actual large motif of this icon. Create a modular system where I could just create a new icon and add a different color, or think about maybe like reversing the palette or something for a different new brand. So creating a repeatable structure for visual layouts is something that you should think about when you're actually creating like a modular brand system. It's just more. I wanted to show you guys just some other work that I think is really great, just in terms of like how many elements they have in their brand system. So like with the hatchery, they have a bunch of different badges to use. A wordmark and logo type here, and then a pattern that is also using some of their custom icons that they've created, and then even like actual like button styles and different things like that to actually define a lot of how this visual language works. So yeah, I'm just gonna breeze through this. So I'm gonna jump into Illustrator and start like actually talking about some of these things and showing you some tools that you can start using. I might just start with actually like drawing the shapes and showing you guys a bunch of different kind of commands that can speed up your workflow. Even if you're just getting started in Illustrator, learning the techniques that I'm going to teach you right now would be just sort of like some things for you to like know to learn first would be Conquering Pen Tool and Pathfinder. Those are usually the two things in Illustrator that people are like, I'm so frightened. But things you find that you actually fall in love with them, and it's like pretty much the thing that you use the most out of any other tools in any other program. I think like every day I thank God for the pen tool. And so thinking about your complex shapes as simpler shapes, and then combining them together to create larger forms. We'll talk about it in a second. And then always duplicate between iterations of your logo or small illustrations. I'm just going to jump into some kind of like some random projects that I've had lying around. So I was branding this thing for a chain.com project that was a blockchain brand. And so you can see a little bit of like the process here. So we were in the middle of creating a wordmark for this project, and we had decided to create a metaphor using different elements of this logo type as assets in a chain. So we had to create like some sort of visual metaphor for how you would sort of like think about. And so if other people are working with Ethereum, this is like the symbol for Ethereum. So we tried to weave some sort of linkage to a lot of the kind of like blockchain and crypto lingo into the actual wordmark itself. So here we were actually representing like the movement of an asset through this actual chain. And in the end, we ended up going with I don't know if it's in here. It was more of like a version of this that was much more kind of basically like sort of like that-ish. So it was more thinking about assets in a chain, and then another asset being loaded into the chain. So think about a super long, straight column of transactions, and this just being a snapshot of those transactions as a metaphor. And so,
is it supposed to look like the Ethereum symbol?
yeah, a little bit.
That's just maybe what that was last week, so that's what I was saying.
Totally. So we're trying to weave these kind of like visual metaphors together. And here you can see that I'm using like just a bunch of shapes to like mask off some of this, actual like typeface to create more of a custom feel. And I think like I kind of wanted to explain much more of like actually drawing the shapes. So I'm going to skip a little bit ahead to kind of like thinking about. It's really weird that creates that chain of things. So here, when you're thinking about drawing in Illustrator, everything is vector, obviously. So you're creating like these different kind of like shape forms. And so here I'm just using the rectangle tool to create a square, and then I'm going to create another shape of a different color, and I'm going to show you how the Pathfinder works. So I also have smart guides turned on, which is pro tip: use fucking smart guides.
Smart guides? What's smart guides?
So smart guides are these little pink things. As you see, I'm dragging these things around, and so it actually tells me when the math is correct. So like, if I really need the center of this square to match up with the center of this rectangle, it told me when that actually intersects. So it's very, very useful for creating.
But is there a way to like, so on like the one next to it, there's a million objects. Is there a way to tell it which one you want it to snap to? Because sometimes it says like intersect center line, but it's just like jumping to every single object.
Yeah, I think like usually what I do is I'll start to look at like the actual thing that I'm trying to like match up to, and like maybe if I'm moving this one, I like now I have the center line kind of like moving towards the center line of the other thing. It'll let you know what you're snapping to, and I think in that case, like if I wanted to have this match up with this, I might actually use a different selection approach. So I'm ungrouping that, which is Shift Command G, and so I can select this shape and this shape, and so basically we know that these two things are not on the same line. Oh, maybe they aren't. So I mean, obviously we can see that these are not on the same line. Some actual selection technique that you might employ would be aligning to a key object. And so if you go up to this like little align tool, you can actually align to key objects. By default in Illustrator, if I select these two things, I just held down Shift and selected these two items. You see how when I hover over one, actually it creates this little boxy box. If I click that, that is now defined as the key object. And so all of my align tools are referencing that one key object. So I could say align it to the center of that object, or I could say align it to the top of that object, or align it to the right of that object, or vertically distribute between those two. But I don't have a third shape here, so it didn't really do anything. Maybe it might be more prudent to be like, really maybe I don't want this shape to move, but I want these two shapes to move. So like here, if I try to like center that, I'd have to like try to remember where that was. Here, if I define the key object, I can just center a line down to one. So these are just like a couple of like really powerful tools that only exist in Illustrator. Like, I don't know, like some other programs have key object selection, but it's like a really painful process. And another thing to like think about would be if I'm trying to create like rapidly create a bunch of like a grid of things, or I've placed a bunch of different things super like lazily and like, oh, I don't know if that's super straight. These can actually be aligned to grids fairly quickly with just a bunch of different kind of like selection techniques. I'm just going to make a really messy system here. So, I mean, obviously this is a very messy grid. And so if I wanted to actually create some sort of structure, I might start by saying like, I'm going to select these 3 items, set a key object, align those to the center. Now I know that those 3 are aligned. And then I can do the same thing on the other side. And then I can select these 2 objects and align them that way. And then what I can do is Illustrator also has, and I'll actually set those. So now I know that these things are on the same vertical levels. And so since I have the same number of objects on each side, what I could do is just select them all and then distribute them vertically using the distribute tools. So Illustrator has distribute tools. And just distribute those evenly. And I can distribute these evenly on this side. And then what I can do is just select these 2 things, or this whole row of things, set a key object here because I want them to be on the same level. And then center line, key object, center line, object, center line. And so now we have the problem of like these things aren't really like all kind of like together in the same kind of like vertical structure. So what I can do is distribute this top row horizontally. Really, I can do this, just do that for all of them. But I can even say maybe I know those 2 things are aligned, so I can set a key object here, align them that way. You're kind of still left with not knowing whether or not this is the same height though. So what you can do, you can also do this with groups. So I might just group these all 3 together, Command G, and now I know that these are all horizontally grouped. And then I can select all of these and say I want to distribute these 3 groups vertically. So now I know that all of these are the same width apart. And so now that was super structured. So yeah, that's thinking about how you could group things easily and quickly in Illustrator. So more on like the Pathfinder, and I have my Pathfinder window here. You have different kind of shapes or different combinations of like how you would combine things together. I'm just gonna make a couple of copies of this. So here, if I'm saying like maybe I want to combine all of this into one unit, I want it all be one single shape. You can just use the merge command, and now I have one single shape. If I wanted to maybe cut out this pink shape out of the black shape, I could use either divide, which would give me also another line here. So divide actually creates multiple objects at every intersection, but it doesn't do it by color, it does it by actually the shape, the vectors that overlap. So if I switch into like my outline mode, which is Command Y, I can see that this would actually create 3 different shapes, because I have this quadrant, and this quadrant. So I just divided that into 3 shapes. And so now I have this shape, that shape, that shape. Maybe I don't want that. All right, so now we're back to just having these 2 shapes. So maybe I just want to cut out only the pink part of that black rectangle. I can actually use the trim feature, and then after I ungroup it, I can see that now this thing is cut out of here. And so, this might seem like super simple and basic, but these are the building structures for how you would actually draw something in Illustrator. For example, I used a lot of different 3D tools to actually manipulate these. And so if you wanted to do that, for instance, I think this has appearance on, so let me just take that away. So here's just an effect that's put on. So this is a rectangle. Say I wanted to make it sort of look 3D. I can go to 3D, extrude bevel. And if I preview it, I can see that now I have these controls for how it actually functions, and I can extrude it deeper or shallower. And I can even lock it to different viewpoints. So all of these, for example, I created a rule for continuity where I would only do it from isometric top. So these are all isometrically created in the same angle such that we have continuity with the system. So, just creating isometric top. And I like to take away the actual light shading because it can create gradients on rounded objects. And I just do no shading. And then press OK. And so now, I have this object that I can change the shape of, do different things to it, but it's still rendering it into a 3D shape, which is kind of cool. But this shape isn't actually a 3D shape. I can't select these points yet, and that's because it's not actually expanded, or the vectors aren't really set in stone. And a lot of this, any effect that you apply to a shape in Illustrator isn't actually on the shape until you expand it. And that's something that's important to remember, because if I, say I created these two shapes and did effect maybe I have round corners stylized. So now if I maybe I'm just expecting this actual round shape to be kind of actually put onto this pink shape. When I go into Pathfinder, actually do my command, I don't get that because this is actually its own affected shape, and the bounds of the vertical shape are still this square. So if I wanted to actually have this cut out properly, I would actually select this and then go to Object, Object, Expand Appearance. And so now the appearance of this object has now become an actual vector. And so now when I actually go to cut this thing out, it cuts out properly. So that's a thing to note. And so if I wanted to actually edit this thing in 3D, I have a hotkey for this, Shift Command / for, whoa. There we go. I don't know why that wasn't working. So that was just Shift Command /, and you can make custom hotkeys for yourselves for different functions in Illustrator, which I definitely recommend. And I have some other ones that are recommended in the presentation. So afterwards, I can take those three shapes and kind of mess with them and do whatever I want with them. So that's a really kind of unique sort of use case for that tool set. Here I actually use those to kind of stroke them together and create different kind of very hard shapes versus more kind of stroked cartoonish shapes. But when you're creating these kind of spot illustrations for a brand, having the color palette defined and having some sort of rule set for how you're going to create a continual system is super helpful when you're going through that. So I got a little bit ahead of myself. Let's talk about logos still. So I mean, every time that I'm working on a logo project, if I make some sort of edit to the logo itself or some sort of minor change, I'll actually select the entire thing, and then I'll go to my Move Tool V. Whenever you hold down Option in Illustrator, it actually creates a copy of whatever you're about to do. So if I held down Option or Alt, I could just click and drag and create a copy of that new thing. So now if I ever need to go back to those things that I had way before I made these choices, maybe I'm I fucked up, this is looking really bad, I can always go back to that other thing. Whereas if I just kept going and adding, to that structure without actually keeping the past movements, I'm kind of stuck. I have to either select everything that I've done and then copy it and then paste it back after Command Z a bunch of times. But that's kind of really destructive in your workflow. So thinking about how you can always just be duplicating these things over and over when you're working is super critical. And I think like for an example of how I might start to think about going about branding or creating a bunch of different brand directions for a certain project. Like this was a sample brand for a Bitcoin space heater. So like using a Bitcoin miner is like has energy to heat a space. And so I started with like home iconography, and I think I did a bunch of different houses before. Maybe this was before that. But then I started thinking about how I would create sort of like any sort of meaning. So like at first I was thinking about maybe you create tokens inside of this home because you're actually like making money on a chain and you're accruing tokens inside of a home. Or maybe this I think this was supposed to be just like a plus inside. So you had like the idea of like it's a window, but it's also like additive. You're like you're making money, income. And then I was thinking about, what if we had different tokens, like, because tokens can be anything on a blockchain, so they could be like all these different little shapes. And then I also thought about, maybe these tokens can also be representative, because I didn't really have like a unique icon, because I think like, this on its own, without the word mark, isn't really that unique. Like, it's not really brandable. So I think part of what I tried to do was start to think about using the same metaphors in a much more brandable way, like using them like an H, or can you start to think about like different linkages in a chain and just different ways to do that. And you can see I had a bunch of different, or a couple different color palettes here in this one direction, and I have like the actual notes on what I was doing, like the reasoning behind a lot of it, mostly because I was showing this to other designers to get their feedback, and wanted to create, some sort of like actual, thing for them to look at, other than just a bunch of simple shapes. And then here, I was thinking about coins flipping, going from like something that's flat to like a 3D view of that coin, creating the H out of it. And then we started thinking about calling it home economics or some other thing. I think this might have been another separate brand, but I was thinking about like plugs or like hardware. And then even so, I was thinking about making an H and an E in an abstraction, but it's also like a nail that goes from one side to the other. Just kind of this really abstract version of like what an E could be. And I think like These is oftentimes like a simple place to start, is like thinking about how you could take a letter form that is prominent inside of the name and actually create some sort of visual metaphor around it. It's kind of like a really simple way to start thinking about how you would like actually create a visual metaphor. And a resource that I go to a lot is this thing called Trademarks and Symbols. And so this is a really, really, really old book by Yasuburo Koyama. But this is actually a full like PDF scan, or just like really high res images of this entire book. Because this book is actually like $400. We try to find it in like any eBay or like crazy source, and it's actually organized by letter. So these old, these are a bunch of old different like metaphors that people were using to try and like recreate, letter forms. And each of these might have had like an actual like industry application. Like these look like rolls to me. I feel like this is probably like a paper or like a like an aluminum sheeting company or something, or maybe it's just toilet paper. Maybe it's butts, maybe it's boobs, or maybe it's an owl turned on its side. That looks kind of cute.
The Bluetooth logo.
Huh?
The Bluetooth logo was on there.
Where? What?
Oh, ABC.
Bottom left.
Oh yeah, Bluetooth. It's there. So thinking about these things in terms of, and this is a really great source of inspiration. Totally go to trademarksandSymbols.com. I do it every time. If for fellows that are here, I have a second edition of this book over on my table. You can borrow it. Just don't fuck it up. It's very old.
The Bluetooth logo is that old? Wait, how old is it?
I don't actually know. That's actually surprising
Or
to
the
see.
ABC logo's in there, I guess that's really old.
I said everybody. And so, I started creating other visual metaphors, or like I started making badges because I love fucking badges. I try to get a badge in every time. Sometimes they get in, sometimes they don't. It's always a kicker. So yeah, and actually text on a path in Illustrator is super fun.
Jacob, do you ever hand sketch before you start drawing? Or just
Most definitely. All of these were sketched on pencil and paper beforehand.
Okay.
And when I'm sketching, I like to think of text and stuff as a mass rather than actual text. So like, if I'm gonna say like, if I was creating like a sketch of that thing, this thing, I might think of it in terms of like a square and like, I don't know, like a semicircle or something. Rather than thinking of it like text and text.
I see.
So like I might just block it out really quickly and be like, yeah, like text up here, text down there, text in the middle, or some other abstract form of that. But definitely thinking about the visual mass of something is really key when you're actually designing these things. So going back, and really we're gonna have like some time at the end to ask questions specifically about drawing stuff. But I think hotkeys you should know would be like generally the move tool is V. A is the direct selection tool, so if I want to select a bunch of like the actual points directly of a vector object, A is the thing to do. Always save your work, Command S. Circle and rectangle are L and M, which is really weird, but I usually just find myself using the M. And also the pen tool, P. And if you're in the pen tool, you can press plus or minus to add a point on an already established vector line, or minus to actually subtract the anchor away from that without actually cutting it. Some other hotkeys that I really think you should learn would be creating a coping mask is Command 7. A compound path, we can actually explain what a compound path is. So like if I have two objects, and say shapes. So Illustrator just sees two different shape paths. And so what I want to do is merge those two paths together so that they're one compound path that share properties. And so you can just do this by going to Object, Compound Path Make, also Command 8, which is what we'll do. And so now I have this gradient which actually goes across that entire shape. So now this whole thing is one unit selectable. And even when I go to direct select it, you'll notice like I'm using my A direct select. I can select like an individual point and change it. But if I try to do that, it moves. But here, when I move these now, they move as one singular unit. So that's the difference between compound path and a normal path like this. Envelope distorting is a little advanced, but basically if I wanted to kind of shoehorn a bunch of text into a square or a shape, I can select both of those shapes and dynamically force that thing into that perspective, which is kind of interesting. So if I really wanted these, going for the cop out. So I just made a text box, and so this isn't a vector yet. I'm just going to create outlines, so Shift-Command-O, and now that's a vector shape. And so maybe I want these to be kind of like going on this pathway where this is the T and then this is the back E. So as long as this object is on top of the word, I can just say Option Command C, and now I have an envelope distort that then I can even distort like this way and that way. So that's kind of super useful. I usually don't like doing this because it creates a lot of weird artifacting. It's not actually true to how you would draw the shape if you were drawing with a pencil. So just be careful with that. I think there's also a lot of other ways that you could distort those things. Illustrator has.
What's that called?
That's called envelope distort. And it has a hotkey built in. But if I wanted to distort that shape or that text, and I think this might be like a pretty fast way to make something look really tacky. So be careful. I am fearful of showing this to you right now because I just know that it's going to end up being bad. But if I wanted to do, what's the art warp. Yeah, so you got a bunch of different warps. You can do some warps like this, some warps like that. Maybe I want it to be a flag. I want it to be really word arty. So that's how you do that. And then you can expand that afterwards to make it actually vector. So like all those things are just effects that are applied to that vector shape. And so if you have something that has an effect applied to it, like let's just say like effect fly around corners. So like if I have that applied there, I can go to this appearance panel, which is in Window Appearance. All of these panels that are over here, if you ever lose them, if you're like, oh shit, like where the fuck did that go? Just go to Window and then whatever you're looking for, and it'll just reopen or it'll add it to your window or your workspace. And so here I can see that this effect is applied to this, and I can just drag it away. Or conversely, I can double click on it and edit the actual thing's properties. So if I want these corners to be less rounded, obviously there aren't enough corners to actually make that mathematically possible. So that's why you have that artifact. Let's see, let's go back. So reversing the foreground and background, we already did that. Offset for duplication. Pasting in place, so if I want to copy something and then paste it right on top of the other thing, Command F, that is how you do that instead of Command V, like Command C, Command V is cut and paste obviously, but paste in place is Command F. And duplicate commands is actually a really useful tool in Illustrator. This is probably like one of my most used things, I think. Like, so say I want to create a bunch of squares out to this direction. I can hold Alt and Shift. Shift is just locking me into like a like freeform movement. So if I hold Shift, it's always locked to that axis or this axis or like a 45-degree if I'm holding Shift. But if I'm not holding Shift, it's like all free movement. So I hold Shift and hold Alt to make, and Alt is just to make a copy of that. So after I do that, if I let go, so that last command is saved in Illustrator in its internal memory. And so if I press Command D, I can actually repeat that command as many times as I want. So that's a really powerful tool to use because, like, maybe I'm trying to create a ring of circles, for example. So I'm going to take my rotate tool, which I pressed R, and you can rotate this circle however you want. But I'm going to, if you click somewhere, and I'm going to hold Shift to make sure I'm straight. But you can click anywhere to say like this is the new rotation point for the circle. And now if I just click and drag, this is my normal rotate tool. I can hold Alt and Shift and lock it to 45 degrees for rotating. And so now I can just say I did that once, and then now I can say Command D, and it'll actually rotate it in the same way again and again. So it's a way that you can actually get that math right in there. Another quick way to do that in a much more advanced way and a much more mathematically controllable way. So I was just like working on this little guy. He's a little flower, he's super happy, but then I was like, well, I don't like how his petals look, so I actually created a different set of petals, and I wanted to create a way to mathematically add a bunch of different petals if I wanted to, like more petals or less petals, depending on a situation. So this can actually be achieved through a tool in Illustrator called the Blend tool. So here I have these two different shapes, and I want to create a bunch of different shapes in between these shapes to blend maybe the color together. I mean, this is an example of a blended color. So I'm selecting these two shapes, and I go to Object, Blend, Make, and so here I have an example of this blend was actually set to specified steps. So you can actually go into Object, Blend Options, and how you have different modes for your blend. So here I have specified steps, 5, and so I can just be like, I want 17, or 1, or 3, or 14. Or I just want a smooth color. And so this creates a number of copies just to create a smooth color between these two shapes, blend. And so I can press OK to accept that, or I can just switch it back to specified steps. We're going to show you something. And then I'm also, so this, if you're creating a blend between two different colored objects, it's always going to create blends of color between those two objects. And I can even, say like, I can alter other things about that property. So like if it's smaller, it'll actually step other properties up. But if I have two of the same color objects, it's kind of interesting. So here, if I create a blend now, I'm just creating the same structure from point A to point B. And so I can actually replace the spine. So this thing is called the spine. And I can create points on that spine to like alter that path. I can start to do like weird things, like making this half torsion or something. So that's a thing. But I can also replace that spine with a different object. So I could just make a star and replace that spine. So what I can do is just create a circle and then select both of them and then go into Objects, Objects, Blend, Replace Spine. And so now this blend is mapped to a circle. But I'm getting kind of a weird little kind of fuck up here. I'm just going to call it fuck up. And that's because my spine wasn't actually as long as my circle. So really I'm not getting all the way around to where I want to use here. So what I can do is back up for a second and I can actually cut this path. And so now I have two different points that one starts here and the other comes around and ends here. And so now, since I'm mapping directly this spine to a form that is a line instead of a full shape, it actually maps correctly. And I would probably create a hotkey for this too, since I've already done it twice. If you've done it more than 3 times, you need to make a hotkey, just a general one. But yeah, so now if I go into blend options, I can create as many of these circles as I want. And I know that math is correct, and I'm not having to do any guesswork with how I kind of like position those things. And sometimes this circle isn't really like orientation specific, but like this flower petal is. So basically, like when I did this at first, my blend options weren't on, so my orientation was set to just straight across. And so if I want these shapes to actually inherit the rotation of the angle at which they're placed, I can set it to do that in Illustrator. Illustrator knows that that's something you might want to do, so it has an option for it. This is also an easy way to like make like little loaders, or if I'm this is positioned on top, so I just took the top circle out of these two and made it smaller to make like a little a sense of movement. You can also still create something of the same of a different color on the other side, and it will still blend properly in this mode. So the blend tool is really powerful, and you can see more about the blend tool when I was actually doing. So this is a bunch of stuff that I made for our last blueprint event. And so I was making these kind of like mathematical equations. I think these are expanded. But these are the originals. So what I was actually doing was I created 2 different sets of blends. And I created, let's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. So let's I can release the blend. And so here, this was kind of interesting because not only, so I want this blend to move from this shape to that shape. So I actually had to position my my shapes in a layer form that actually would put them in order. So, you know, if this shape was on top of all the other shapes, there would be an ordering in which the first shape that's on the bottom would be linking to the one that's on top. So basically these are all staggered. So this one's on the bottom, and then this one's on top of that one, and this one's on top of that one, and this one's on top of that one, in like an actual sequential order to affect the way in which Illustrator actually made the blend. So just keep that in mind when you're making a blend. But what's kind of cool about this is that, you know, when I actually go to make the blend, I don't have to do any of this. Like, I don't have to draw like 80 lines. I can actually just, you know, make a blend, and it's going to draw those lines for me in 3D space. And, you know, or actually just the appearance of 3D space. There's no actual 3D going on here. You know, and I'm not smart enough to do that math. So, but you know, I could actually make that taller. I can make it shorter, lower, higher, wider, just by editing a few points in this Bezier curve. And then I just created another one going in the opposite direction, and kind of like just laid them on top of each other to create the illusion of a three-dimensional object.
Those lines that you started with, that was just hand-drawn?
So I was actually looking at like famous mathematical positioning vectors, and that was part of my brand story for that event. So, you know, going back to, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but like, you know, thinking about how you're going to create different sort of like attributes for or visual iconography, you can start to think about themes. So the theme for this event was vectors, whereas, you know, vectors in terms of like direction. So, you know, I was thinking about lines and like groupings of movements to create the simulation of movement. So, you know, here like my background texture is actually a swirling wind vector pattern, and I created a bunch of different movements, both in two-dimensional space and in three-dimensional space, to give the appearance of actual like movement iconography. So what is that? What is the visual kind of language that is associated with that feeling that I want to convey, and how can I illustrate that? So that's just how you kind of can start to think about those things for when you're actually thinking about, you know, how to design those things. So just jumping into building a visual system, and we've already talked about a lot of this because I get ahead of myself, but whenever we're creating kind of like brand libraries here, and I like to call them visual libraries. I don't know if that's like an actual term or whatever, but I mean, usually people just call them like style guides. But a visual library to me is a little bit different than a style guide in that it's also a resource for a designer if they're wanting to pull the visual elements that I've designed into their own designs or products. I'm assuming that here that this person is somebody that is either on a team with you or on, you know, people on the core team, like all the people in CoLab SF, they have to design things that have like a CoLab feel and a brand feel. Usually I would have style guide specifications for how that works, like, you know, an illustration guide or like, you know, the rules that I use to create those illustrations. But in addition to that, I like to create a library of visual assets for them to grab that is in like Illustrator or Sketch or whatever, so that they can quickly grab a bunch of different things and then easily make something, a layout like super branded. Like they know that this is a CoLab thing because it's got all the CoLab shapes and all the CoLab colors and the typefaces and all that. So usually when I create a visual library for a project, it includes the logo and wordmark pairings, so how you use the logo and wordmark, a color palette, typeface pairings and rules, the stylistic illustrations like what I just showed you guys with all the vectors and stuff, an icon family, which is like custom created icons for maybe like a web application or different kind of like uses on like a website, or like values, brand values would be another good thing to create icons for. And then also a brand pattern or patterns. Usually you create patterns such that you can have an easily brandable like swath of shape to just be like, you know, the inside of this box. I can brand the inside of this box by having my brand pattern on it. So just thinking about how you can cover a lot of ground with something that's very minimal and as is made inside of the brand style is just a way for you to round out that library. Some other non-visual elements you should also find are your brand values, intentions, and your voice and tone standards for like writing. So I mean, thinking about your brand point of view is very important. I think it's not usually very visual. So like, I'm not really covering here. I think you could have a whole talk on just brand values, and we did last year. So that's very important. I'm going to cover it probably later in some of the other CoLab After Dark sessions. So I just want to talk type for a little bit. And so choosing a typeface for a brand is kind of like, it can be dangerous, and it can be like really time consuming, and you know, people will get angry at you and be like, why are you using this typeface? And I think a lot of the times, you know, when you're not the designer for a brand and you have to like inherit some typeface that you're not familiar with, sometimes it can be struggling. There can be a major struggle between you and like, you're like, I just hate this typeface and I don't know why it's used. But I think when you start to define different layouts or different rules for those typefaces, people actually start to really come to love those choices a lot faster. And so for an example, you know, I just made this layout in like 20 seconds, like literally a bunch of different type styles in a bunch of different fonts. But I'm just taking the same thing that I had on the last slide and creating a small layout with a bunch of dummy text. And I did it in a bunch of different sizes and shapes, and I thought about the type not as type, but as visual mass. So like we were going back to those logo types, like I don't think of the type as just like a typeface. Think of it as like a square or rectangles that you're trying to grid into some kind of actual structure. So here I have 4 type styles. So there's like a small caps hero style, and there's a big display style that showcases a lot of these like nice forms of this typeface, and then also a small sub-display style, which is like not really that important. So like if you have like information that you're not really like super keen on, like, you know, this isn't necessary to read, but I really want to round out a composition with some sort of text style, making it a lot smaller and, you know, keeping it super like fixed width like I have it here, can let that thing fade into the background. And so a lot of the time it's a balance on how you create rules for those typefaces to either create a very assertive presence or a kind of subdued version of, you know, this is just an option. You know, like if I'm presented with a bunch of different you know, options in a drop-down, I want the options to be showcased, and I want the heading in that drop-down to be very small. So it might just be, you know, I create sub-brand or sub-type styles just to fade into the background and provide you information, but they don't get in the way, or they don't draw attention when they don't need to. And then I also have just a copy style with a guttered layout for reading. And I actually chose a serif typeface so that you could actually read that better at small sizes. And I know this is not indicative of like an actual size of something that you would probably read in a normal setting. Just wanted to create. So breaking down that layout from the last slide, this is that layout in square format. And then above here is actually how I was thinking about you know, laying this out. So I created these little spacer blocks, and I do this in really quickly in a form called block gridding. That's what I like to call it. So like if if I'm trying to say like I need to know that these spaces are the same, sometimes I'll literally just like draw out a shape and just be like, oh, does that match up? Yeah, cool, works. And I just refer to that as block gridding, and I'll do it a lot in my layouts because I just want to know that all of these things are equidistant. So here in this layout, all of these things are equidistant, and I can use that shape as a unit when I'm trying to divide things. So I divided this entire slide page into 2, and then I bisected them into 2 sections, and then gave this side like a 2.5 padding of 2.5 of these units that I was using. And then I had 2 large rectangles that were on either side reflected, symmetrical. But one was a display font, so it's large and prominent, and the other side was a guttered body text, which was much more light. So I'm forcing a lot of the actual visual mass to the left here. So you can start to think about how you know, you start to divide these sections up, and then start thinking about how, and this is just more of like me thinking in terms of like a very bright thing that's very large attracts a viewer's eye, rather than something would be like, if you can think of a copy as like a very faded out small thing, that actually is like less, there's less attention being drawn to that. So thinking about how you actually use those kinds of like, those things are used in the art world to actually create movement in a piece. So how can you start using it in your designs to create some sort of informational hierarchy? So this grid system uses equidistance, elements of asymmetry, but also symmetry, and I bisected the entire thing in half. So that would be like an analysis of what I did to create that system. So controlling use of faces, like really, so I used 4 typefaces in this, and all of them almost look the same because they're actually used in ways that take advantage of each of those typefaces' unique properties to create a system that is more pleasurable for the reader to actually read. And a lot of the times people will tell you like, oh, you only need to use like two typefaces max, maybe 1. And I think like I oftentimes I'll agree with that, but I also think that when you start to define different rules for how you use certain typefaces, you can really start to have those typefaces shine in the properties that they're actually built for. Like to me, I use this knockout typeface because it has a lot of really expanded letterforms that make it look really amazing at really large sizes. And obviously I wanted to use the serif typeface for copies so that I could have the actual copy view more easily read. And I wanted this style to fade away, so I used a fixed width typeface. And at the top, I wanted to create the same sort of feeling, but it's more large and prominent, so that you can have some sort of like, hey, this is actually an attention-grabbing thing rather than something that would fade away. So determining how you actually use those things and creating those rules can help you start to use typefaces in a more controlled way. That's not to say like use 20 typefaces in everything you design, but I think there is value in using more than 2 typefaces or more than 3 typefaces. And there's a great article by Bethany Heck, who I'm a huge fan of, linked in the back of this presentation, which I think you guys should read. And so when I'm pairing typefaces, I just create a bunch of different sizes of text in a way that I might create a layout, and then I start just dropping in the fonts that I'm thinking of pairing together. And a lot of this is kind of trial and error. I think things to think about would be like how are you thinking about size? And when you are thinking about size, are you using typefaces that are meant to be large? Or are you using typefaces that are meant to be small? And I think that's something that just comes from a lot of type study and like immersing yourself in just a bunch of things. Like we're in a world where like everything that we look at has been designed with some sort of like intention. So exposing yourself to as many like printed documents and like things that have text on them, and then figuring out what you like and what you dislike in those pairings is really key in you knowing how many typefaces are out there, like what foundries are producing the things that you like, what you dislike. So shaping that typographic kind of preference is really key in honing your skill as a designer. And I think like knowing different formats of creating those rules about how you use those typefaces is really key. And I think like as a general rule, you can think of like sans serif typefaces are much more performant as display formats. So like if I'm trying to make like a huge thing that's going to be on a billboard, I might use a sans serif typeface. Whereas if I'm going to make a Bible that's going to be filled with text and super small, I would use a sans serif typeface. Or serif typeface, I'm sorry. So the serifs actually have like the leading structures on each side of the glyphs so that they carry your eye from one glyph to the other, so it's much easier to read. So thinking about those basics, usually I like to have like a bare minimum typeface or type pairing for like a brand would be a sans serif display font and serif copy font. Or you can even go, sometimes you can even go sans serif for both. But, it just depends on where you're going to be. If you're going to be on a printed book, I would definitely recommend using a serif font. Whereas web, you can have a more comfortable reading experience because text is actually pretty large on web. At least that's how we've been kind of like built to design now. Thinking about actual brand assets, so this is going back to that visual library of like me creating things for other people to use. You know, I like to create as many templates as I can within a given allotment. So if we go back to that that blueprint style guide, like this was actually the visual library that I sent to everybody for their like decks. And so basically they were using these like cover slides, and these were like made in the format of like a 1080p slide that could be shoved in a Keynote, copied and pasted, you know. And so I was just like, you know, moving these elements around and creating compositions. And creating little layouts for them to use and just be copy pastable right into their documents. So a lot of these, you know, were also like, you know, vector elements that they could put in if they needed like something for a really kind of like, you know, a different layout rather than one that was already pre-designed. And also thinking about another thing that I like to create are these kind of like color. I don't really know what I call them right now. There's just more of like amounts of how a color should be used in a color palette. So, you know, maybe I would say like, yeah, really use a lot of the black. Like I want this all of this brand to be super dark. So that's the largest like swath of that color. And I want these to be used really sparingly. So, you know, use these in sparing amounts. So I create sort of like a color amount guide for somebody to like think about when they're starting to, you know, design those things, those assets. So yeah. And then also thinking about your illustration styles. So like, you know, there are a lot of different rules, and I think rules are kind of key for how you want to design your visual system. So, you know, when I'm starting out a brand, I might actually think about, you know, okay, I'm going to only do you know, isometric top shapes, and I'm going to extrude them by 50 each, so they're all the same height. And I'm going to use this. Actually helps you create a bunch of illustrations that share the same properties and have the same kind of like overall feel. So creating those patterns and those rules are really key in how you're actually creating your stuff. So an example, so I did this other project where we were doing this thing called Inbox, where it was more about like messaging on Ethereum. So I created like, it was like a little play on the @ symbol for like our emails. So it's but it's also like a hexadecimal key. So just wrapped it around and also made it sort of a message bubble. And so this word mark can be used. And so like I actually create like a good contrast guide to like let you know what colors you should use this on and what you should use it on. In my libraries. And then so you can see that I had a full word mark and then a smaller icon for other uses. But then I also had like the hexacodes for all these colors, and you know, I had rules for how you would want to use that in print. So you know, I had different specifications for if you were using something for print. And then I created a custom icon family. And I have like both the stroked and non-stroked. So like the thing about Illustrator is that you can actually set a preference for scaling your strokes and effects. So if I turn that on, I can make this as big as I want and it'll still scale that stroke. But if I have that off, and generally I kind of turn that off because I like to illustrate in in the same stroke width. So keeping your stroke width consistent when you're working in like icons and stuff like this is very important. So like if I'm going to create like this icon with this, you know, this envelope, if I created another stroke that was, you know, like maybe 1, like I can see how, you know, maybe this is a style choice, and like you could say that like, yeah, I'm intentionally creating thicker strokes on the outsides of my icons than in the centers, which that could be a rule, right? But here I've actually, you know, set a rule for all monoline same width icons, or same width stroke icons. And then only if I want to scale that up do I ever turn that scale, strokes, and effects on. Or you can just merge it so that you have like, an expanded, so like, if I do my object expand and expand it to the fill and stroke, now this is no longer a stroke, it's an actual vector object. So I like to have the live versions and the merged options just in case somebody wants to grab the stroke version. Because like then, we have these rules with angle terminals. So, there's no rounding here except for like the one exception I made for the envelope, because I didn't want it to be so sharp. But here I have all angle terminals. And then so for the illustrations, I actually employed a bit of texture. And so, that was a rule. So I wanted to create a sense of this icon that we had, which was also like a cool little, like a loader. So it would be like up and down and left and right, and it would play in like a little kind of like rotating icon set. But it was also like an actual block in a chain. So thinking about how you could represent this thing. So like, the block actually represented an account. And so all these things that you were adding on top were elements that had texture, so they were differentiated from the account, but they were all actions that you could perform with an account. So you can store like value in an account, you can send and receive from an account, or you can search for accounts. So it was just a way of me saying this is this one thing that I'm going to keep the same every time, and then create this kind of like human element of texture in when I'm actually designing these things. So it's sort of like putting those two things together. And then when I did actual these are zero state illustrations. So like, if you hadn't put in things to like search for or something, or if you didn't add an email address, thinking about how you design your applications to handle zero states. Like if you haven't had somebody sign up for an account yet, like how do you like create a notification that like something is different in this UI? So I just created a bunch of illustrations and like a word saying like, hey, you should add an account because you haven't added any accounts yet. Zero states are actually a lot of that's a thing that like really improves the user experience, but a lot of designers don't think about. So designing illustrations for your zero states is pretty key. And here you can see to reduce the file size, I actually don't have these in this. I created a separate resource to like save everybody's hard drives, just because and these are just vector or raster PNG exports at 600 ppi. So, and then I also created like a web animation that this is the resource for that web animation. And so I actually just created the source so that if anybody could just grab that just in case. So this would be an example of like a visual library that somebody can actually go take and use and repurpose that into like wherever you would need to do it. So super key. Another thing to think about would be like, and so this was like another application that I was designing for my first crypto wallet sort of thing. So like, if a user was like, or a child was trying to like get into cryptocurrency, like, I don't want to think about fucking numbers. Like, I just want to think about like these like little animals in a title pool. And so I just designed a little interface where like the only number is your actual value. So, if I'm gonna buy, I can actually donate or not donate, but deposit money into my checking account by buying little fish to put into my my title pool. And as its ecosystem diversifies, so does my portfolio. So it's kind of like that little play on stuff. But I think here I designed a system where I would only use these like primitive shapes and they were rounded at 45-degree angles. And so that was really key for throughout the entire process. And I actually created a very kind of it was a very varying color palette, but they all were very saturated colors, just because I wanted to be really bright for the kids. And then thinking about your level of abstraction, and there's actually a really good series on Netflix. What the fuck was that called? Was it Abstract?
Oh wait,
It was Abstract. The first one is with it's like Christopherson or something. I don't know. Watch the first episode. Really great. Just because it's thinking about how you abstract something, or the levels at which you could abstract a realistic thing. So here I was going for a lot of realism with very simplistic shapes. and I think like the level of abstraction that I went with was like, I think the bare bones level of abstraction is like a line, right? Where here I'm taking that one step up when I'm adding color and mass. I'm not using any strokes to indicate like actual texture or anything, it's just color. So thinking about how you can keep that uniform across things. And I tried to overlap things as little as possible, but I mean, obviously you have to make a few kind of exceptions. So yeah, so thinking about those illustrations. And also brand icons and patterns. So there was this other brand that I was working on for some people named Workmans. And so they gave me instructions for a bunch of icons that they had different meanings tied to their family. And so I just started to create these icons that were just representations of what they told me. And so I created a bunch of different iterations of those icons in both in kind of like form factor and in abstraction level. So they actually ended up going with a much more simplified version of these icons. They were just like literally strokes. But here I actually had a bunch of different icons that had highlights and shadows. And I think when you can start to abstract this down, like a less abstract version of this would literally just be me taking away the highlights off of these icons. And then a step below that would be making them less detailed, and then a step below that would actually be altering their forms to only be strokes. So trying to think about how you can start to either make something more detailed or less true to life can actually help you in forming some sort of illustrative style. Notice that these are also one color. Like literally those highlights are knocked out, so I can just have the background show through whenever I want. And I also use them in the form of a pattern when I was like trying to think about their packaging design and try to like lay things out. Also, like mocking things up would be very important. It's actually a great kind of like a morale booster, I think, as a designer to like see things in physical form, even if they wouldn't live in physical form. I'm someone who really loves physical objects, so I think like seeing how a brand goes from digital to the physical object is a great thing, or a great thing to practice, just because now you know the bounds of what your system is, right? I mean, I think like a lot of the time, if I can't make a good looking business card or a good looking like poster with the brand that I've created, I start to be like, is this really something that I like, or should I go back to the drawing board? So think about how those things transform into other objects and other assets later on down the road. An example of this, so applying a system to your assets, like thinking about how these things are going to transform into other things. For example, I mean, and after you've done all this groundwork for creating a library, doing this is probably going to be really simple. But a lot of the time, you're also going to have like a bunch of different challenges on like, if I need to create a bandana design for something, I might not have planned for that in my original structure of a library. So having some kind of like either some already pre-made mocks or layouts to help me piece that together quickly is really key. And I think often find that like when you're starting out like with your base colors and then laying elements on top can actually really help you when you're trying to like create a very simple one element feature of a brand in a space. So like, for example, we had our annual blueprint event, and this was just from like applying my branding to like the actual signage. So I had just a bare layout with like a logo and some text, and I used that layout when I needed to make a welcome poster. It wasn't like super hard. It was just like, let's put some elements in there, and just use the template that I already made. And we also had these cool little these kind of like acrylic boxes that were made from acrylic and wood. And so I just took the same brand colors that we had in acrylic and then laid out the patterns on top of them so that we could actually have a branded object that was physically there in the space. But those are like super simple elements. It's not like it's very complex, but it's still branded and it's still uniquely that style of thing because I use those elements over and over again. And when I created the the illustration style for this. It was much more limiting, I think. I bent a few rules for like how I was creating like the organic shapes, but I still stayed true to having just the yellow and the teal as the two defining features in this whole event. And I think when you think about how you define your accent colors, you can start to use them as a way to create a different modular split. Like, you know, if I'm going to say like, oh, I have two major portfolio areas for this event, well, I have these two accents to work with, so maybe assign one accent to one portfolio and the other accent to another. So finding ways that you can use your color palette or visual elements to like actually divide things into like modular pieces can be really helpful when you're trying to like do something like an event where you have you know, like a limited amount of resources to actually, you know, put towards designing something. And then obviously, you know, we had the keynote slides, and then we had these prototype signs for each one that I created. These little abstract. Well, they're not really little because they're actual size in this document, but you know, just created a bunch of things where I created holes for text here. So thinking about how you can design for a layout that has text in the same place over and over again. And then start to think about how you can lay those elements in such that they don't interfere with text, or design layouts that do that for you, helps create less work for you later on down the road. And so for these, you know, for these name tags, I even started to create like different custom versions for each one because I had so many visual elements that I could just literally almost algorithmically generate these things. And I think as controlled as you can be with that iteration and creating that uniqueness helps put more of a kind of like really special mark on how you create those assets. So as unique as you can be with your things, be unique.